The second video for this week deals with the writing of James. Specifically, it deals with who wrote this document that we have in the New Testament that we call James. Now, part of why this is hard to discern is there is no original New Testament document anywhere out there as far as we know. We have no what are called autographs, that is, originally handwritten documents by the original folks who wrote them. And the reason that's important to say it out loud and first is that it can be very easy for preachers and scholars to say they're absolutely 100% sure that X or Y did Z in the New Testament. And the truth is, we can only be as sure as our best guess. Our best guess, our best hypothesis based on the evidence in front of us. So we need to look together at the evidence in front of us and make a determination. And one of the things you will find in your research on James, if you go looking at authors about this epistle, is that there's a really strong split in whether or not people think the author of this epistle was actually James, the brother of Jesus, or whether the author of this epistle is somebody we don't know who's writing in James's name. That is, whether or not the author is using a pseudonym, a false name. Let's start with this question of James. There are a number of Jameses in the New Testament. The first James we run into is James, who is the brother of John and the son of Zebedee, in Matthew 4:21 and in the parallel texts in Mark and Luke. So you have a very famous early James. He's always with Jesus. He's always one of the three or one of the four that's called up to Jesus. He's very, very important in that early Christian ministry. Then you have mentioned at the foot of the cross a Mary, who is the mother of James the Little. James the Little's brother's name is Joseph. His mother is one of the Marys, but he does not appear to be the brother of Jesus. Then you have a James who is always listed as one of the apostles, called James the son of Alphaeus. And we hear about James the son of Alphaeus in Matthew 10:3, Mark 3:18, Luke 6:15, and Acts 1:13. So you have a very strong testimony to the fact that there is a James, a brother Alphaeus. Then there is James, the father of an apostle named Judas, who is not Judas Iscariot, that we hear about in Luke 6 and Acts 1. And finally, there is the James who is called the brother of our Lord in Galatians 1:19, who is the James in Acts 15 and the James running the early Jerusalem church. As a side note, you'll excuse me, I have a rotten head cold. So, why do scholars think that the writer of this is James the Just, or James the brother of Jesus, and not one of the other many Jameses in the New Testament? After all, Jacobus, which would have been the Hebrew name, and James becomes Jacobus, was a very common name. So why is it this James, the brother of Jesus? Well, these are some of the pieces of evidence the scholars use to make their best guess. Number one, the author does not identify himself as anything other than James, which suggests that the author expects that if you get a letter from somebody named James, you know who it is. That's kind of like getting a letter from somebody named Madonna and knowing who it is. So the lack of identification suggests that this is a very famous, a very well-known, a very well-respected James. Secondly, the diatribe about faith versus works in chapter 2 suggests that the author of this may have known something at least about the teaching of Paul. He may or may not also have known something about the writing of Paul, but certainly knew something about the teaching of Paul. Now, Paul's conversion happens just before James of Zebedee is killed, which means that it is less likely to be James of Zebedee than some other James. And as for famous Jameses, really the only two famous Jameses are James of Zebedee and James the brother of Jesus. Third, you've got Acts 15 showing that James the brother of Jesus sends a letter to the churches. So he has done this at least once before. There is some evidence that he has done it, and so this is a possibility for James the brother of Jesus as an action he would have taken. Fourth, if you read the Epistle of James, you find concern about purity, about Torah, and about a commitment to the poor. And we know from having read Paul and having read Acts that those are the things that James cared about deeply. So the preponderance of evidence points to James, the brother of Jesus, the James who is in charge of the church in Jerusalem, sometimes called James the Just. That is the preponderance of evidence. That does not mean we know for certain. It is our best guess. Now, even if we can say with a strong certainty that the author intended by the writer of this epistle is James, in other words, the writer of this epistle expects those who read it to understand the epistle as having been written by James, even if we can say all that, the question still remains. Is this actually James? Could it actually be James? Or could it be somebody written in a false name? Could it be a pseudonymous author, somebody writing in James's name? Some of the questions that come up. James is written in a very good Greek. It's actually some of the best Greek in the New Testament. It is second only to Hebrews as some of the best Greek in the New Testament. So, could a Galilean Jew have written such good Greek? That's been a huge issue for scholars. And until the writing of a scholar named Martin Hengel, we didn't think this was possible. But Martin Hengel's great study showed that early Palestine, first century Palestine, was deeply Hellenized. That is, its culture was very, very, very Greek, which means that the people of first century Palestine would have been able to speak and write, if they could write, a very fluent Greek as well as a very fluent Aramaic. That is, they were bilingual. These were bilingual people. And so it is possible that someone from Galilee could have written Greek, especially since the big city Sepphoris is not far from Nazareth, and that would have been a big center of Greek culture. Further, the Greek in James is not classical Greek. It's heavily Septuagint Greek. Septuagint Greek. Septuagint, of course, is the translation of the Hebrew Bible from Hebrew to Greek that took place in Africa. And that translation became the Bible of the church, because the church had no New Testament. The church was writing the New Testament. It had no New Testament. So the Bible of the church was the Septuagint, the translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim. The Torah, the law, the Nevi'im are the prophets, and the Ketuvim are the writings. So the whole Hebrew Bible into Greek. James is clearly influenced by the way in which the Hebrew writers translated Greek. He is very influenced by the way in which the Septuagint uses Greek. And so those things point to the possibility that the author is at least a Hellenistic Jew. Not some later Hellenist, not some later Gentile pretending to be James, but at least we know this author should be a Hellenistic Jew. Secondly, a big question comes up that James is not in any of the early canons of church documents. When the church starts collecting the holy documents, the Gospels and Paul and so on, and saying, these are the holy texts of the Christian church, James is frequently not among them, which some scholars have said means that James must have been written fairly late, and must not have been accepted as a real book of the Bible. Other scholars have suggested, however, that since we know James was well used in the Eastern Church, particularly in North Africa, and that Eusebius and Origen accepted James as written by the brother of Paul, that the problem was not so much that James was not accepted as that James was neglected. It's not so much that James was not accepted as that James was just not read. It was neglected. So that becomes an issue, and where you stand on either one of those things, well, James or not James. Then there's a question of James and Paul. If the letter depends on the actual writings of Paul, then it had to have been written after James was killed, because Paul's writings post-date James a little bit. But if it was written on the teachings of Paul and not the actual writings of Paul, then it could be contemporary with Paul. It could even precede the Jerusalem Conference. So where you come down on that in scholarship depends on where you date the epistle. Finally, there's a question about how late James could be dated. If you can find that other writings quote James, then that makes James an earlier document. If you find that no other writings quote James, then James must be a later document. Well, scholars have argued that 1 Peter, 1 John, and 1 Clement all quote James, which means that James must be an earlier document and not a later document. Further, they've pointed out that James does not make any mention of the siege of Jerusalem in 70 like Mark, Matthew, and Luke do, which makes James an earlier document probably rather than a later document. They've also pointed out that James refers to the church as elders, not bishops, and refers to the gathering of Christians as synagogues, not ecclesia, not assemblies or churches. So it's using earlier rather than later language. Finally, they've pointed out that the way in which Jesus is spoken about, the Christology of James, is what is called a low Christology. You don't have Christ high and exalted and lifted up as you have in Paul. You have a much lower Christology, and that again suggests an earlier date and possibly a relative. So that's kind of the evidence that's out there, and how you weigh this evidence determines what you think, whether James is early or whether James is late. I happen to think James is early. I actually happen to think it was written by James, the brother of Jesus. I've changed my mind on this. I used to think it was late, and then I went back and reviewed the evidence again and looked at some other arguments and have changed my mind. So it's okay for you to change your mind too. You can decide that you came into this class thinking James, the brother of Jesus, wrote this, and after having heard all of the arguments pro and con, have decided, maybe he didn't write it. So, where do you stand? What do you think? Given what you've heard of the evidence, where would you place James? Would you make it early or would you make it late? Why would you do that?